So what I'm hoping to do today is to cover a few central aspects of the main thesis of the book, The Mismeasure of the Self. And in particular, I am going to focus on some epistemic vices, which I call vices of superiority and inferiority. In particular, I look at the vices of arrogance and the vices of servility. And I am also going to, in addition to saying what they are, I'm also going to talk a little bit about the epistemic harms that they cause. First of all, let me indulge me in showing my book. It's available for purchase from Oxford University Press. It's also going to be available as an Oxford scholarship online. And so you don't need to tell me that anything on Oxford Scholarship Online very quickly ends up in Russian websites. So I'm sure it will be available to everybody very quickly. Right. So let me give you, first of all, the big picture of the framework of the book. So one of the features of the book, which I'm not really going to talk about very much here, is that it develops a view of the psychology underlying virtues and vices of self-evaluation. And what I argue is that these virtues and vices are underpinned, or if you want, their causal bases are attitudes, which are attitudes understood in the sense in which social psychologists understand attitudes. And that is a summary evaluations. So my view then, as it will emerge quite clearly, I think, is that the behaviors that are characteristic of certain virtues and vices are to be seen as the product of attitudes, which are psychological states, of evaluations of certain features. And in the case of the virtues and vices that I'm interested in, these are evaluations of the features of the self. And so I am going to hopefully show to you why these virtues that I'm concerned with, which are the virtues of the measure of the self, are accurate evaluations of the self for its worth, whilst the epistemic vices I'm going to talk about are mismeasures of the self, i.e. they are constituted by clusters of evaluations of the self that are faulty or that constitute mismeasures, and that's why they are vices. Hopefully this will become clearer as I progress. But this slide gives you the architectonic of the book. The book is primarily concerned with a cluster of virtues. These are humility and intellectual humility, which in itself consists, in my view, of two components, which are usually related, but can conceptually be distinct. And I think, as a matter of empirical fact, can also come apart. And the one component is modesty about strengths, and the other component is acceptance of weaknesses or limitations. And here is acceptance is understood not just as knowing that one has weaknesses and limitations, but owning up to one's weaknesses and limitations. And that means that you don't just know what they are or think you know what they are, but you also prepare not to reveal those to others. You're not inclined to hide them. And so these would be the two components of humility and intellectual humility, which I characterize as a positive attitude to the self. And what that means is an evaluation of the self or features of various features of the self that is overall positive, and that this evaluation of the self that is overall positive is guided by a motivation for accuracy. So the person who is humble and intellectually humble evaluates their strengths and weaknesses, and that's so out of a motivation, if you want, to have an accurate picture of themselves. And on the basis of this motivation to have an accurate picture of themselves, they evaluate their own self-worth or personal worth, if you want to use Jason Byers' terminology. I think connected to this virtue are two other virtues, one of proper pride and the other proper concern from esteem, but I'm not going to talk about them in this talk. Most of the talk is dedicated to the top half of this picture, namely the four vices that oppose modesty about strengths. And these are the vices of superbia, which is a form of arrogance, the vices of arrogance, and on the other, these two are vices of superiority, and on the end, two vices of inferiority, servility and self-abasement. The book is equally concerned with the vices in the bottom half of this picture, which are narcissism and vanity on one hand, as vices of superiority, and fatalism and timidity on the other hand, as vices of inferiority. I should say, you might already from this picture wonder whether I'm actually talking about intellectual virtues or moral virtues. I, in a sense, follow Linda Zagzewski in thinking that there is not a clear distinction between these two sets of virtues. So people like Lani, who sort of focus on skills, clearly make a distinction between intellectual virtues as skills and, moral virtues, if they don't think that moral virtues are skills. Of course, people like Julianus think that moral virtues too are skills, right? But I think that neither moral virtues nor intellectual virtues are skills. I think that they are both, at least when it comes to self-evaluation, they are both based on cluster of attitudes. I also think that there is a way of thinking of an intellectual virtue as a component of the moral virtue. So if you think of humility as partly modesty about strengths, then you can think of intellectual humility as modesty about intellectual strengths, and as humility in general as modesty about all strengths, including the intellectual ones, right? So if you look at things this way, then intellectual virtues just are a component or a subset of the more ethical virtues. They are just that aspect of the ethical virtue that concerns intellectual conduct. On the other hand, as I hope it will emerge in this talk, given that I think that these virtues and vices are clusters of attitudes, and that these attitudes are evaluations of the self, and that these evaluations of the self can be done out of a motivation to get a correct evaluation, or out of motivations that are of other sort, then in this picture, it also turns out that actually moral virtues are partly characterized out of their relation to epistemic motivations. And so you don't have a clear distinction between the moral and the intellectual. In one sense, the intellectual is evaluation of as part of the moral virtues, just that part that is relevant to intellectual features or intellectual content. On the other hand, the whole of the virtue is part of the result of being driven by motivations that are either motivations for accuracy or motivations of another sort. And so the intellectual and the moral aspects of these virtues and vices is totally intermingled. I hope that's clear. Right, so let me say a little bit about intellectual humility. And as I've said, I take intellectual humility to be humility about those aspects of the self that concern intellectual strengths and weaknesses and intellectual content. So as I said, I take humility to be a combination of modesty about intellectual strengths and acceptance in the sense of owning intellectual limitations. Now, modesty about successes or intellectual strengths is not ignorance of what those strengths are. So if you are familiar with Julia Driver initial paper on modesty, she claims that the person who is modest is ignorant of their own strength, not too ignorant, but somewhat ignorant. And so she sees modesty as requiring an underestimation of one's own abilities. I don't think that modesty requires underestimating our own ability or being ignorant of what they are. In the same way in which acceptance of limitation, the other part of humility, is not the same as being resigned to one's own limitations. It involves owning up to them, but it's wholly compatible. And in fact, I believe it requires a drive to improve so that to remedy one's limitations. So I've said that modesty about success and acceptance of limitations are the two components of humility. When I say that humility is the virtue of having the measure of oneself, so that this evaluation of one's own successes and of one's own limitations are in some sense the right one, I do not mean that they are accurate, because humility is compatible with making honest mistakes about the worth of one's abilities and achievements. What I mean, rather, is that these evaluations of one's intellectual features for their value or their worth is driven by a motive of accuracy. So let me give you an example. It is perfectly possible for, I think, a scientist who has made a scientific discovery to make a mistake about the significance of that discovery. For instance, she might think that it's more important than it actually is. But this misjudgment can be an honest mistake. And because somebody overestimates in this way the extent of their success, this person is not necessarily unhumble. What matters, though, is that this person's evaluation of the worth of that success is driven by the motivation or the desire, if you want, to give an accurate assessment of its genuine worth. So this is what then I mean by saying that intellectual humility and then humility involves evaluations of aspects of one's own character and intellectual projects for their worth that is motivated by the desire for accuracy. So for the desire to have the true measure of one's own abilities, irrespective of whether one actually is accurate. And so I then think of intellectual humility as a form of self-appraisal, and in particular as a form of appraisal self-respect, where one proportions one's self-esteem to the actual worth of one's own intellectual character. And so this account of humility, right, is compatible with somebody thinking that one is capable, and it's even compatible with thinking of oneself that one is more capable than other people, provided that this appraisal is motivated by the desire to have the true measure on one's own abilities rather than the desire for one-upmanship or the desire to be better than other people. So let me now start talking about two vices of superiority. I call them superbia and arrogance. I use the Latin term superbia. I do not know what the term in Italian, the term remains the same. I do not know the term in Portuguese. And I use this term because there is, in my view, no accurate English language equivalent. Usually superbia is translated into English as pride, but I think that is a mistake, since pride can be a good quality, well, superbia never is. In this slide, I want to give you a sense of what superbia is and what arrogance is by describing the behaviors that follow from them. I should though say that it is possible for people occasionally and not consistently to display some of these behaviors without actually having devised themselves, and also how deep or entrenched the vice is will cause these behaviors to be more frequent or to exist in more situations of different kind, and so on and so forth. So this slide is about the behaviors that follow from superbia and the behaviors that follow from arrogance. So I take it that the person who suffers from superbia is somebody who boasts about their achievements. It's not just somebody, it's somebody who is immodest about them, thinks or feels that they've got, a lot of achievements to their name, and they boast about this. So they are immodest about their achievements, not just because they overestimate them, but because they brag. They feel and act in ways they are superior to other people. They arrogate special entitlement. So they behave as if, or even claim, that they are deserving of special treatment. I think in the intellectual realm, this is particularly evident of people who will not accept that others disagree with them, who will not respond to challenges to their claims in a moderate way by engaging in discussion, but that tend to respond to challenges by dismissing the other person's view. And so people who suffer from superbia tend to dismiss and silence other people. People who suffer from superbia tend to care a lot about comparative judgments and establishing pecking orders. I don't know what Brazilian academy is like, but in other parts of the world, a lot of academics really care about who is the smartest person in the room, right? So this is an example of the sort of thing that I call superbia. People who really care that they are better than other people, smarter than other people, and that everybody believes that they are smarter than other people. So these are people who compare themselves a lot to other people because they really care where they come up in their hierarchy. I also think, and I'll say in a little why this all comes together, that people who suffer from superbia are very prone to anger, and they tend to have a self-inflated sense of themselves and pride. So this is superbia, which I think is a kind of arrogance, and as I'm going to say in a second, is characterized by assessment of the self for his own worth that are wholly dependent on the need to feel superior to other people. Now, not everybody who we would describe as arrogant engages in behaviors that are primarily behaviors designed to push other people down so that they can emerge as better than the others. There is another form of arrogance, which I called hubristic arrogance, that is characteristic of the people who think of themselves as untouchable. If my example of superbia is the arrogant academic who always silences other people and thinks that they are so much better than anybody else, my classic example of the hubristically arrogant person is the banker who thinks that they are so infallible and so invulnerable to risk that engages in such risky behavior to lose basically other people's money, as it happened in the banking crisis in 2008. So the characteristics then of hubristic arrogance and of intellectual hubristic arrogance are the characteristics, the behaviors of a person who is a risk taker to the point of irresponsibility, that takes such risks because they feel infallible. They also think of themselves as totally self-reliant and feel that they have no debt to anybody else, but they owe everything they have achieved just to their own effort. So these are the two sets of behaviors. So if you think of superbia and arrogance in this way, then it makes sense to think of superbia as an evaluation of the self for its own worth that is dependent on feeling superior to other people, right? So if the person who is intellectually humble evaluate themselves for their own worth with a view to trying to get an accurate measure of themselves, so driven by the desire to know themselves, the person who suffer from superbia can only feel that they are worth anything, can only develop a sense of self-worth if they feel superior to other people. And so their self-esteem, right, is not proportional to their actual worth, but is only preserved by the sense that they are better than other people. And so requires that the person who can only value themselves if they are better than other people requires that they push other people down in order to feel good about themselves. Arrogance is also hubristic arrogance, that is also a form of arrogance, and so has this sense, again, this sense of self-esteem that is dependent on being better than other people. But instead of being manifested in the kind of aggressive behavior that pushes other people down, it is manifested in the aloof behavior of the person who thinks of themselves so far above anybody else that they don't need to even engage with them. So this gives you a sort of picture of the sort of behaviors characteristic of these two vices and of the kind of evaluations of the self for its worth that might give rise to these behaviors. So these are the two vices of superiority. Let me now talk about the two vices of inferiority. These are servility and self-abasement. I'll try to be a bit quicker about these. So I think of servility as the same as obsequiousness. And the person who is servile or obsequious is the person who feels and acts inferior to other people, is the person who is the yes man, is the person who seeks acceptance by other people by parroting their views, is the person who lacks a sense of self-esteem or a sense of entitlement and accepts other people's humiliating behavior that is highly differential, that tends to agree in debates and just seeks, to the favor of powerful people, but at the same time lacks in self-pride and is prone to shame. So these are the behaviors that characterize servility. I think of self-abasement as a deepening of servility, one that involves being risk-averse, feeling that one cannot trust one's own judgment, feeling that one needs to depend on other people's view, and importantly, somebody who feels that every time they succeed in something, that's because the task was very easy, or because they just were lucky. So I think that these behaviors also are the results of evaluations of the self for its own worth, including his own intellectual worth. And these evaluations of the self as not worth very much are dependent, or if you want, serve the need to be accepted by one's affinity group. So these are people who evaluate the self for its worth, not by seeking to get the true measure of themselves, but by seeking to assess themselves in a way that makes them accepted by a group that doesn't hold them in high regard. And self-abasement is a deepening of this tendency that occurs when an individual thinks that their best intellectual policy to find out what to think is just to discover what other people think and adopt their views. So part of my work then relies on trying to provide a sort of moral, or if you want, epistemic psychology of these biases based on the empirical work of social psychology. So I have described the behaviors characteristic of superbia arrogance, and I have said that they stem from a faulty form of self-esteem or self-evaluation. Faulty not necessarily because it is inaccurate, but because it's not driven by a need for accuracy. The motive for these forms of self-evaluations are to feel good about oneself, and one achieves this by pushing other people down. And so then I have argued then that superbia and arrogance are manifested in this way because people who have these vices actually lack in self-esteem and trying to secure it by finding a sense of self-worth not in what is actually of value, but in thinking of oneself as better than other people. Now, if your own sense of self-worth is based on the need to feel good about yourself, and you can feel good about yourself only if you feel that you're better than other people, then other people are a threat to your sense of self-worth. Hence, the aggressive response that is characteristic of superbia. And so the argument here is that the superbia is really grounded in its defensive form of self-esteem, where there are deep insecurities about self-esteem that are masked by a defensive response of inflating one's sense of self-esteem by pushing other people down. And I think that there is empirical research supporting these claims. There are various studies on so-called defensive self-esteem, where defensive self-esteem is self-esteem that is measured as high when you ask people, what is their opinion of themselves, but is measured as low when you measure their self-esteem indirectly, i.e. measure it in a way that they are not aware that what you're measuring is self-esteem. They think you're doing something else. And so these people have a combination of low self-esteem when self-esteem is measured indirectly, i.e. when it's measured without them knowing that what is being measured is self-esteem, but high when self-esteem is measured directly. These individuals who have defensive self-esteem have been shown in a number of social psychological studies to respond arrogantly to threat, to self-announce, to boast, to be quick to anger, to be spiteful about other people's successes, and to have higher level of prejudice toward members of other ethnic groups, but also to have higher level of self-deception, and to have a propensity to overestimate the extent to which people agree with their own views. They react badly to negative feedback by derogating the views of people who disagree with them. And interestingly, and I think this is particularly telling in the case of hubristic arrogance, they adopt interesting strategies to preserve self-confidence. One such strategy is self-sabotage. So I don't know whether this is true in Brazil, but in the UK, among the upper class, and certainly among people who go to Oxford, it's not just important to succeed or do well, it's even more important not to seem to be trying. So at Oxford is always said that there are only two good degrees, a first-class degree, which shows that you're smart and you have studied, and a third-class degree that shows that you didn't try. And by not trying, no one will never know whether you're smart or not. So this is an example of self-sabotage, where you do not prepare, you don't even try to succeed, so that the question will always remain open, were you good or not, right? And so people who suffer from defensive self-esteem, if they often engage in this exercise of self-sabotage, they don't even appear to be trying. And finally, people who suffer from defensive self-esteem tend, if left to their own devices, always to compare themselves downwardly. So they compare themselves to people who they think are worse than them, so that they can come out with an self-assessment of themselves as superior. And they compare themselves downward by trying to figure out the ways in which they differ from these people who are not very successful. If forced to compare themselves to successful people, they will compare themselves for similarities with people who are successful, so that they'll see how similar they are to successful individuals. So in sum, I think this empirical evidence and the arguments I provided previously suggest that people who suffer from superbia arrogance do not have the true measure of their abilities, not just because their self-evaluations are inaccurate, they could by sheer luck be accurate, but because their self-evaluations are not driven by the motive of accuracy, of the motive of self-knowledge, but they are driven by the need to feel good about oneself. And they tend to satisfy this need to feel good about oneself by derogating and pushing other people down. Conversely, there is empirical evidence that people who suffer from servility and self-abasement, who are people who want to be accepted by groups that hold them in low esteem, develop evaluations of the self that are biased not by the desire to have the true measure of one's own abilities, but by the desire to be accepted by the group that holds them in low esteem. And so these people might, in reality, when measured indirectly, have a sense of self-esteem that is not low, but when they are asked explicitly about their own assessment of their own worth, they will say things that suggest that they hold themselves in low esteem. And so what you have is the opposite, right? You have esteem that is measured highly, perhaps in indirect measure, but low in explicit measure. And so we can think of this self-esteem as damage, and people sometimes think that this damaged self-esteem hides some kind of glimmer of hope and self-pride. And again, there is empirical research on people who have this form of damaged self-esteem. They especially suffer from what's known as depressive attributional style, which is exemplified in these 2 points in the slide. So they attribute any failure to their internal qualities. So they think that if they fail, it's because they are stupid, but they attribute any success to contingent features of the situation. So if they succeed, they think that it is because the task was very easy, even they could do it, or because they think they were lucky. These same people judge others to be better than them, exhibit nervousness or anxiety, have their highest levels of suppressed anger, lack self-confidence, tend to conform with the majority view, and adopt strategies of social comparison that lower their self-esteem. So if they're arrogant, if left to themselves, compare themselves downward for difference, people who have damaged self-esteem compare themselves to successful individuals for their differences. And so they always compare themselves upward for difference. And so that in their mind then will confirm that they are worse than other people. If forced to compare themselves downward, i.e. to non-successful people, they'll do so to seek for similarities with unsuccessful people in order to again confirm that they are not particularly good. And so those who suffer from servility and self-abasement, by the way, I realize here that in my slide, I've made a mistake with cut and paste. So I say the arrogance, it shouldn't be arrogance, it should be servility. So those who suffer from servility and self-abasement then do not have the true measure of themselves because this time their self-evaluations are driven by the need to be liked by others who do not value them. So let me just sort of very briefly say what I think some of the epistemic consequences of these vices, which are both ethical and epistemic, are. So I have said that the vices of arrogance, servility, superbia, and self-abasement consist in self-evaluations that are on one hand driven by the need to feel good about oneself, on the other hand by the need to be accepted by other people who don't think highly of you. These self-evaluations then are forms of what is known as motivated cognition, right? So motivated cognition is reasoning, where the reasoning is driven, or if you want, the process by which one seeks the evidence and evaluates the evidence one has, where that process is driven not by the motivation to be accurate, but by other motivations, two of which are the motivation to defend the self. And I think this form of motivated cognition is typical of arrogance, or the motivation that is known as social adjustive, which is the motivation to fit in with one social group. And I think that this form of motivated cognition is typical of servility. And so these vices not only themselves are the result of faulty self-evaluations, but they also induce, in general, failures, in epistemic performance because they promote engagement in motivated cognition in general. They also harm self-trust and self-knowledge. That's because the people who are arrogant tend to have an inflated self-trust, and the people who are servile tend to have a deflated self-trust. And of course, in order to perform epistemically, one needs to have some sense of one's own abilities, right? In order to be a successful epistemic agent, you need to have a sense of what you're capable of and what you're not capable of. Because if you try to do something you're not capable of, obviously you will fail and you will have wasted your time. At the same time, if your sense of your own abilities is deflated, you will not engage in activities where you could have succeeded. So again, you don't gain the epistemic goods that you could otherwise have had. And also, they harm self-knowledge because, as I suggested, they are forms of self-deception, since they are evaluations of the self for its own abilities. They are driven by motives other than accuracy. The result are likely to be inaccurate self-evaluations, and so they are forms of that's not quite right. So they are driven by motivations other than accuracy. So they are likely to be faulty as a result, but they are forms of self-deception because if you knew the motivation that drove your evaluations, you would have to abandon the evaluation itself. So if you discover that the reason why you think highly of yourself is because you need to feel good about yourself. Then you wouldn't feel so highly about yourself, because that motivation is not a particularly praiseworthy motivation, right? And so these epistemic vices and the evaluations that are part of them are self-undermining in this way, and because they are self-undermining, they can only be sustained through self-deception. Further, these vices cause harm to other people. So people who suffer from arrogance are too certain, too self-confident, they mislead other people, they deny others the epistemic credit they deserve, they play an instrumental role in epistemic injustice, and they cause other people to become vicious, to become timid and servile. And servility and self-abasement are forms of excessive deference, which again can mislead people into thinking that what they say is right because everybody seems to agree with them. And they facilitate vices of superiority in other people. So I will not cover the problems with vanity and timidity because I haven't got the time, but I hope this gives you a sense of the overall picture. So, obrigada. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was very interesting. I registered myself in the questions, but I'm going to give the first question for Professor Len Watson. You can speak, Professor.
Hi, thanks very much. And thanks, Alessandra, for that overview. I confess that I have the book sitting nicely on my desk, but I haven't read it yet. So this is a very, very nice way to get the lowdown and a preparation for reading it properly. My question, which you may well address in the book, but my question is around basically the kind of premise of this idea of the mismeasure of the self, that there's a true measure of the self, and that's kind of the premise of the intellectual epistemic component. And I take it that that premise is at least, you know, there must be some way of understanding that isn't sort of like there is only one true way in which I can evaluate my abilities in lots of different ways in order to be able to therefore exercise intellectual humility with respect to those abilities. So I just wondered if you could unpack that notion of a true measure of the self.
Yeah, thank you, Lan. So by true measure, I actually do not mean a measure that is accurate, but I mean a measure that is driven by the motive of accuracy. And so it's possible for somebody to have the true measure of the self, even if they make some mistakes. And in fact, I want to say that in an extremely hostile environment, one could have a true measure of oneself and be really, really off the mark at the same time, because the environment is full of deceiving and misleading evidence, right? So that, and then I agree, there are different ways of, well, there are different differences, right? So first of all, when you are trying to, in my view, when you're trying to get a sense of an evaluation of the self for its worth, right, there are different components of the self that you are evaluating, right? So, I don't know, you might be evaluating your skiing abilities, right? If that's something you care about. You might evaluate, you know, their reasoning ability. You might evaluate, you know, how you behave with other people and so on and so forth. So there are different things you evaluate, and there will be different standards that you use for all of those. So for some, right, are about moral conduct, and so you will evaluate them by certain values that you hold, right? So the idea here is that you evaluate the worth of certain features of the self. Now, what that evaluation is like depends on what is the feature that you're evaluating and what kind of worth is relevant to that feature. So sometimes will be the moral worth, sometimes will be the aesthetic worth, sometimes will be the epistemic worth. But the virtue of humility is the cluster of all of these evaluations, each of which is driven by the motive of accuracy. But the standard used will depend on what is being evaluated, whether it's a moral worth, prudential worth, an aesthetic worth, or whatever. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah, really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you for asking the question. It really helps to clarify things.
So now we have Alessandra Ziani de Borba with one question. Alessandra.
Hi, thank you very much, Professor Alessandra. You was talking about servility, self-abasement, arrogance, superbia. They seem to be intimately related to some emotions, right? Such as pride and so on. And they seem also to me to impair our rational function. Like when we are anxiety about our future, we have we might have expectations which are irrational, right? Or when we think of ourselves as very good in a way that we are not, we might cultivate kind of expectations which are irrational about our futures. So I wonder if this doesn't show that to function rationally, we need a kind of appropriate emotional condition. And if you do this kind of, if you talk about this in your book.
Hi, Alexandra. Thank you for asking this. So yes, so one of the things I couldn't cover is that I hope that one of the features of my account is that each of the devices has, and the virtues too, has a distinctive motivation, which is an emotion, but more specifically not is an emotional orientation. So the emotions can be thought as mental states that have a beginning and an end. So there is an episode of anger, you become angry, you're angry for a bit, and then you stop being angry. But instead, I want to talk about emotional orientations, which are dispositions to feel certain occasional emotions often or in a certain range of situations. So I think that each of these vices has orientation. So for superbia, for instance, that's anger. For servility, for instance, that's shame. For humility, I think is hopefulness. And I think that these emotion orientations are really linked to the function of the evaluations of the self. So the reason why the person who is arrogant often is angry is because their own self-evaluation relies on being better than other people, so other people are a threat, and an emotional orientation of anger is often a response to perceived threat, right? When you think that those threats are threats to your sense of self-worth, right? Shame, right, is a sense of, is part or a sort of emotional orientation of shame is a sense that one falls short of standards, which makes sense if servility is seeing yourself through the eyes of people who do not hold you in high regard, and try to evaluate yourself in a way that makes yourself acceptable to them. And humility, I think, is the virtue of requires proper hope, because humility is acceptance of limitations. But if you accept limitations in a resigned way, then that's not a virtue. So to answer your question is, yes, I agree with you, absolutely, that virtues involve a proper emotional orientation, and that without that proper emotional orientation to our actions and to the future, is not possible to conduct yourself virtuously in both the moral and the intellectual realm. And I think my account can explain this fact. So thank you, I agree, essentially.
So Professor, I would like to ask you a question myself. I have been thinking a lot about hypocrisy lately, and a lot of what you said in your presentation made me think of this concept and much more. Do you think that makes any sense to think about hypocrisy as a kind of failure of self-measurement?
Did you say hypothesis?
Yeah. Hypocrisy.
Could you give me an example?
I'm thinking about, for instance, Linda Zagzebski, which thinks that maybe there's a kind of hypocrisy in which the failure is more a kind of epistemic failure than a moral failure. So, for instance, people that made sincere judgments about their own guilty, but they may seem to suffer from a form of self-deception or something like that. So the concept that is in my mind is the concept of hypocrisy.
Oh, hypocrisy, right? I now understand. Yeah.
Sorry for the pronunciation. But
no, it's okay.
The question is if you think there's any sense to think about that concept in a way, as a kind of failure of self-measurement.
Oh, I don't know. To be honest, I don't know. I would have to think about this. I mean, it is part, I think, of a feature of epistemic vices, and Qasim Qassam also talks about this, that they tend to hide themselves, right? So it's a feature of a vice that if you suffer from it, you are prevented from seeing that you suffer from it, right? So it's very rare for arrogant people to be able to see that they are arrogant, right? And my account would, I think, explain why. So you could think that hypocrisy also has this feature, perhaps, that people who are hypocrites find it very difficult to sort of see their own hypocrisy. But I can see why it would be an evaluation of the self, perhaps, but to be honest, I'm not sure. I would have to think about it. It does be, so in that regard, I agree that it could perhaps be considered as a bias, but I haven't thought about how it would fit in my schema. But thank you.
Thank you. We have now a question from Celso Oliveira. He says, usually we judge arrogance afterwards, that is, after a bad result. It assumes that the failure was already determined before taking the risk, which seems to be a poor description of the situation at the time of the decision. Once it was not, how could we demand virtuous behavior? This question is in the chat.
Yeah, I've seen it. I suppose I don't agree with the premise that we judge arrogance afterwards, but maybe I don't understand the question. Could Celso explain to me?
Yeah, maybe so maybe hubris is a better term. It's like hubristic behavior when you decide to do something that is bold, is taking a risk. And yeah, so the state of the world at the time of the decision, it hasn't a truth value in the future that is already determined that you're not going to be successful. And usually after something happens and a bad result comes, and then you can judge yourself and says, oh, maybe I was hubris or something like that.
Right, right. I got you. Now I got you. Thank you. So I suppose I disagree with the premise, right? So I think that you can be hubristic, take a reasonable risk and succeed, right? So it's not that if you are hubristically arrogant, you fail, you know, you might succeed. What makes it a case of hubristic arrogance, whether you succeed or fail, is the fact there is an irresponsible risk taking, right? Even if the risk can be irresponsible, even if, you know, you end up being lucky and succeeding. But also there are these other behavioral tendencies. There is this idea that one is untouchable, that one is invulnerable, that one, and you see it in the behavior and also in the claims that some people make, right? So it's a certain kind of entrepreneur usually, right? That sort of seems to think that, first of all, they owe nothing to fortune or, you know, their family, but everything is, you know, the result of their own efforts, that they feel they can't be touched. So I'm thinking of this kind of personality, right? And I think you can judge, I mean, they, of course, will not think that their risk-taking is irresponsible. They, of course, will not think that they are mistaken in thinking that everything they do is just due to their own efforts, right? But we can see that there are certain people that have this attitude, and it's this attitude that I want to call hubristic arrogance, irrespective of whether they succeed. I mean, there are several people, I think, that have hubristic arrogance, but they've also had luck and they've become multi-billionaires, right? But that doesn't make them less arrogant, you know what I mean?
So we have five more minutes, and we have two more questions. The first one from Eduardo, which says, do you believe that the vice of arrogance can, in a particular case, be the source of the virtue of intellectual courage somehow?
So I would need, again, to know from Eduardo more specifically what cases he has in mind. So let me speculate, and then Eduardo, if you want to say this is not what you meant, please come in. So arrogance comes with supreme self-confidence, right? Which is usually misplaced, but is supreme self-confidence. And of course, if you have supreme self-confidence, you will stick with your opinion, even when perhaps everybody else disagrees with you. And that might seem a form of intellectual courage, the courage of your own opinions when everybody else disagrees with you. I hope that's the kind of case Eduardo has in mind. In answer to that, I want to say that that is not a case of courage, but is a case of recklessness. And so I don't, although I'm not a person who thinks very much in terms of the unity of the virtues, I don't think that sticking to your views because you think you're so much better than others is genuine courage. Even if it might seem courage, because you don't back down even when everybody disagrees with you. Eduardo, did that cover the kind of case you had in mind? Anyway, I hope it did.
So the last questions from Bruno. He says, thanks, Alessandra, for the presentation. My question is, some definitions of intellectual humility highlight the social dimension of the virtue, while you mentioned the knowing our own limitations account, which seems a more individual description than the first one. Do you think this first account is wrong or incompatible with your proposal?
Thank you. Yes, so I'm I think that what you have in mind is the kind of accounts of humility and the intellectual humility that consist in a decentering of the self. Or you might have in mind more a priest, much more interpersonal accounts of intellectual humility. So either way, I don't think my account is strictly incompatible with them. So I think my account says that some of the things they take to be defining of intellectual humility, for me, are consequences of intellectual humility rather than defining of them. So I take intellectual humility to have the proper measure of your own abilities, but the moment you have the proper measure of your own abilities, that given that we are all finite being and all have limitations, will entail the kind of, not in the strict logical sense, but is likely to lead to the kind of decentering of the self that people like Jen call right have in mind. And also, I think it will tend to involve then the kind of treating other people well, or in the way in which Maura Priest and others think of humility as a kind of almost modesty as politeness, as Alan Wilson talks about. And so the two accounts are different, but I don't, and in a sense they are incompatible if you want to say what is the definition of the virtue. But I don't think they are incompatible in the sense that they all can account for all the phenomena. So what I'm trying to say is I agree with people who say these are features of humility, the centering of the self and so on and so forth. I just think that they are not the defining features, but they are consequences of the defining features. I hope that makes sense. But thanks for the question. I think it's an important point, and a large chunk of the chapter in the book actually is dedicated to explaining how these other accounts can be incorporated into mine in the chapter on humility.